Okay, thanks very much, Ron, and thanks to Marion also for inviting me to give this talk. So we heard from Peter Diggle this morning that design matters, and I think part of my message is going to be that design matters. But it matters in the context where there's a huge demand for better information about biodiversity, on more taxa, and on more areas than we can cover. And so there's a lot of interest in what can we get out of slightly less good citizen science data, because we may have those data available and we may not be able to afford to collect more structured survey data. So we're engaged at the moment at the BTO in reviewing some of the information about these types of approaches. And what I want to do is just to highlight a few examples during this talk, both of some of our own work, but also work by quite a few other people who've started to look at these questions. And I think in terms of empirical evidence, there's still rather little empirical evidence where people have actually been able to compare structured survey data for monitoring biodiversity with unstructured data of various types. So, as I say, there's a huge demand for biodiversity information. Some of the sorts of information we used widely in the UK. This is the wild bird indicator for a range of different species groups, highlighting, for example, the massive decline in farmland birds, which has led to huge expenditure on agri-environment schemes. So these sorts of statistics are really important in terms of driving policy. Also at individual levels, here are breeding bird survey trends in the UK. We increasingly need more detailed information. When we set up this scheme, there was one UK conservation agency, and essentially the problem was thought of as a UK scale. Now we have different agencies in each country, and you can see, in fact, for this particular example, the yellow hammer, there's an awfully big difference with what's happening in Scotland compared with what's happening in other parts of the UK. So I'm going to start with the UK Breeding Bird Survey as an example of, I think, one of our better set up structured monitoring schemes that we've developed at the BTO. It's been running since 1994. It's our main scheme for monitoring population changes of common breeding birds. We monitor over 100 species. It's carried out by large numbers of volunteers in something like 3,500 randomly selected squares across the UK. And it replaced a former scheme called the Common Bird Census, which I will talk about a bit later on. So we're looking at standardised annual bird counts carried out along 1 kilometre transects across squares, as you can see illustrated here. Each square has 2 visits, 4 weeks apart, so that helps us to get both the resident birds and the migrants that arrive somewhat later, by which time the residents may be singing a bit less. I say 2 transects, 1 kilometre in length. We divide these into 200-metre sections, and we've got habitat data associated with each of those sections, and we count all the birds seen and heard in distance bands to give us some information about detectability, and then all these data are generally collected online these days. So this is the idea of distance sampling. If you were doing a more detailed professional survey, you might collect much more detailed data, but even from just having 2 distance bands within 25 metres up to 100 metres and beyond, we can get some really useful information about detectability. And recently we've extended this approach by asking volunteers to actually record whether they detected a bird by sound or by sight, and that's adding further ability further capability to what the sorts of modelling we can do with these data. So we can look at detectability in relation to habitat, in relation to visit, and here's just a very obvious example of why you need to know about detectability. This is just looking at detectability against size of bird. And you can see here that if we look at large birds up here, like say a goose, then you've probably got 0.6, 0.7 probability of detecting it. If you're looking at a small bird like a warbler, you've maybe only got a probability of say 0.2 of detecting it. And of course, these sorts of detectability issues will arise not only across species, but also very much within species in relation to things like habitat. So you're much more likely to see a bird in open country than you are in thick woodland. So for the BBS, we've done a lot of work now over the last 20 years to validate various aspects of the approach. We've looked at species difference in detectability. Fortunately, we find that that detectability doesn't actually affect population trends. So although we use the detectability information widely for spatial monitoring, we don't use it in our routine trend analysis. I think the main reason for this is that the trend analyses include a site factor which takes out much of the variation in detectability, which is essentially spatial and related to habitat. Observer effects are not important, we've been able to check that, but again, many of those are controlled for by the site effects in our trend analyses. We've compared the CBC and the BVS, as I'll come on to talk about in a minute. We've looked at habitat, we can look at habitat-specific trends, models, spatial abundance, get population estimates, and we can incorporate these data in demographic models, because for birds, we're fortunate that we have volunteer schemes that not only collect information about numbers and distributions, but we also have schemes that collect information about demography, so we can use that information to build population models. So, I now want to say a bit about the common bird census, because we were very fortunate, and I and my colleagues argued quite strongly when we decided to switch to the breeding bird survey, because at that stage there were concerns that the common bird census might not be giving us very reliable information, particularly because the sites were observer selected. But we were fortunate to win our case that we should be allowed a 7-year period during which we run both schemes together. I think it's relatively unusual to be running 2 schemes of that sort together. So we can get some useful information by comparing what we found from the common bird census and the breeding bird survey operating at the same time. So the CBC was a mapping census focused on farmland and woodland. It involved a huge amount of field work. Somebody taking on one of these sites would do 8 or 12 field visits, during which they'd map every single bird that they saw. The observations were then transferred to species maps. There was quite a complex, but not maybe statistically repeatable process through which territories were delineated by expert staff analysts. We were surveying 200 or 300 of these plots every year. Observers selected their own plots that they were within the key habitats of interest, and the plots were largely restricted to southern Britain. So this gave us very high quality data and apparently quite good population indices, but there was a big question of, are these plots biased? Do the observers choose the places which are best for birds? And what we found was that in most cases they weren't seriously biased. So there was actually a pretty good correlation for most species between the index derived from the common bird census and the index derived from the breeding bird survey. So that was really quite encouraging, and it has enabled us to calibrate the 2 schemes so that we can produce and still produce long-term trends going back to the 1960s. But that was only for southern Britain, the area of the square there. So in southern Britain, there were only 9% of species where we could actually demonstrate a significant difference in the trends measured from the 2 methods. However, if we looked at the whole of Britain, which we can now monitor with the breeding bird survey, and compare with just southern Britain, then the picture is very different. We found that about half of the species show differences in trend, essentially between southern Britain and northern Britain, which means that the breeding bird survey is giving us a much more reliable picture of what's happening for the UK as a whole, but it also means that we can go back and maintain this long-term time series for southern Britain. And it also suggests that the lack of a formal random sampling scheme within this wasn't an absolutely massive problem in terms of the inference you could draw. You'd obviously always like to have a formal sampling scheme, but there are all sorts of reasons why that's not always possible. And here's another one. We do, as I said, quite a lot of demographic monitoring, again involving citizen scientists using quite detailed protocols to study the success of nests or to study the survival of birds by ringing them. And nest record cards that we collect, for example, give us information on all these different nesting parameters. And when we build this information into this information can't have a formal sampling design, because to do this sort of work, you simply have to find places that are practical to undertake the sorts of field work you're doing here, and to grovel around in the bushes finding all the nests and the sort of stuff that you're doing. So that means that really, I think for these sorts of schemes, a formal sampling design would be impractical. But we've been doing recently a lot of integrated population modelling. I'm not going to go into this in detail now, but essentially these integrated population models seek to predict the observed population change from the census data, from the demographic parameters also measured by volunteer surveys. Remember that the census data are now from a formally structured scheme, but the demographic data are not. And we have a nuisance parameter which summarises the stuff that the mismatch between the two schemes. And what this shows is simply that the mismatch is small, less than 20%, often less than 10% of the variation is stuff that we can't explain with the measured demographic parameters. So again, this suggests that although it would be really nice to have really rigorous random sampling of everything, provided you've got a reasonably representative sample, that does seem to work okay a lot of the time. So there's now huge interest in collecting biodiversity data over the internet. This is the BTO's bird track. There are similar portals for this in many other parts of Europe and other parts of the world. There are systems for collecting data in this sort of way for a wide variety of other taxa as well. And for example, you can just point and click on your map here to say where your observation is. You just quickly enter it online, and that's done. And this shows a heat map for the coverage of a project called Eurobird Portal, which we've just started with our European partners. And this is bringing all of that observational data together for the whole of Europe. So most European countries have a scheme like this, but they're all a little bit different. But we've now been bringing that huge amount of information together. And I think over the next few years, there are going to be some quite exciting things we can do with those data. But some of these data are lists, some of the data are presence only, and that raises some really big problems, which I'll go on to talk about. I can escape from this slide here. Yeah. So the next example I want to talk about is some work by Swedish colleagues. So in Sweden, they have a portal where they've collected essentially just casual observations of birds. No structure to the data at all. People just see an interesting bird, they write it down, they send it in. Huge amounts of that information. And here are some of the sorts of birds I've picked out. Particularly, they found that for species like the waxwing, which are nomadic, so numbers vary quite a lot from year to year. They get some quite reasonable correlations with their casual observations. But for other species like the fieldfare, a common breeding bird in Sweden, the correlations are not so good. So here, what they've done is they've compared, this is in a paper published in, I think, 2011. They've compared the Swedish bird survey, which was a transect data rather like our breeding bird survey, conducted on a regular grid, with their casual observations collected through their species gateway, which, as you might expect, are biased towards the more southerly parts of Sweden. And also, as you might expect, the numbers of observations since this gateway started in 2002 are going up, and they're measured in, that's 500, they're measured in increasingly towards the million mark, whereas they've got a smaller number of these breeding bird survey routes, a few hundred breeding bird survey routes, I think, covered once per year. And essentially, they looked at the correlations that they could get out of these two schemes. And what they found was perhaps not surprising to me, because I think there are lots of problems with casual observations, but maybe a bit disappointing that they may have been hoping for a better match. But they found that although there are some correlations, this is the CV of the Swedish bird survey, you can see that the numbers of any of these correlation coefficients here are really pretty weak. So really the correlations between those simple observational data and measures of population trend from a structured scheme were not at all good. And I think that's the sort of thing that should make us be quite cautious about the increasing demand that we must be able to get something out of these sorts of casual data. However, there are other ways of looking at the collection of this sort of information, principally the use of lists. So we increasingly get people putting stuff onto their phones, and what we encourage people to do within BirdTrack and a number of these other monitoring schemes is to collect complete lists of all the birds that they've seen. And the advantage of that is it gives you the absences as well as the presences. So you know when you went out and you didn't see a particular species of bird. And then you really have something that's a bit more useful to work with. And just a very simple illustration of this. This is the numbers of records of swallows from BirdTrack through the year. You can see they're obviously not here in March, then they arrive, but then it appears that they start to disappear again. Well, they don't. What this is telling you is simply that bird watchers get very excited about spring. They all rush out, they make lots of observations, then they get bored with recording swallows, and so the numbers go down. If you turn it into lists, it looks a bit more like real biology. There you get a nice increase, and for this particular species, a nice plateau, and you can fit models to this to show the pattern of arrivals. And here's a different species, the chiffchaff, a small warbler that arrives early in the UK. And here's just the pattern of latitudinal arrival. So this is the date, and you can see that as we move further north, the arrivals are progressively a bit later. So you can start, if you can get at least list information, you can start to extract useful information about phenology. So the Americans have a scheme that does this sort of thing. It's called eBird, and they've done some interesting comparisons between eBird data. In this case, they're mapping, they're looking at spatial models and how good are the spatial models they can get from eBird compared with their breeding bird survey. They've used something called their STEM approach, which stands for Spatio-Temporal Exploratory Models. I can tell you a bit more about that if people want to ask about it, but I think I should just keep going for now because we're probably heading towards lunch quite soon. So this shows the amount of eBird data increasing over time in various categories, lists and other types of records. And this line, which you can maybe see here, more or less horizontal, shows the effort going into the breeding bird survey. So whereas the breeding bird survey effort is pretty constant, they're getting more and more data all of the time from eBird. So given that they're getting this huge amount of data, how well can they do at producing spatial models? And the answer again is a bit variable. So there are some species, like this one, the western meadowlark, where they've got two models that are really pretty similar. Other species where there are some differences, but the models are broadly okay, like eastern kingbird, and yet others where the match really isn't very good. And I think they concluded that in fact there were problems with both models for that particular species from both of those data sets. So there's some quite good matching for at least some of the species looking at these sorts of data. And what they've done is they've looked at if you increase the sampling intensity, how does that improve your model fit? And what they found is that for some species, it more or less increases in parallel, generally with the breeding bird survey getting more information per datum than eBird. For other species, it converges. So as you get more and more data, eBird heads towards the BBS. That's quite a nice result. But for quite a lot of other species, it diverges, which means that as you get more eBird data, it doesn't get closer to the BBS result. And they've used three different estimates of model consistency here. And what you can see is that for quite a lot of these cases in the blue, depending on your choice of metric, quite a lot of them, you are getting divergent behaviour. So again, that causes us to be a bit cautious about some of the inferences we can draw from these sorts of unstructured data, at least with this particular analytical technique. So an interesting recent development has been the application of occupancy models to some of these types of data. So the idea of an occupancy model, if you're not familiar with it, is essentially if you have, say, 2 visits as a minimum to a site, and you can assume closure of the population, then if you saw the bird on one visit but not the other visit, then you can get some information about detectability because it must have been there on the visit when you didn't see it. And this is essentially a framework rather like mark recapture models. And Mark Kerry and others have applied these to some dragonfly data from the blue hawker dragonfly, for example. And you can see here that you get a rather different elevation profile if you just fit a simple model, like a logistic regression model to these data, or some sort of spatial model, or if you fit a model that incorporates occupancy where you've actually corrected for detectability. And similarly, if you use a map, this is showing the mismatch between a simple model and a more complex, and an occupancy model. And again, you can see that the differences scaled down here are not uniform across the landscape of Switzerland in this case. And some more examples, very briefly, from similar sorts of approaches applied by Arco van Strien and others to butterfly and dragonfly monitoring data. Again, looking at occupancy models, looking at listing data. Quite good agreement between the detection probabilities obtained from monitoring data and from complete list data for these species. Again, complete lists and monitoring data give you very similar detection probabilities on average, but short lists or single record, not very surprisingly, don't give you such good detection probabilities. And in general, if you look at trends in occupancy, now these aren't the same as trends in abundance, these are only whether the animal is in that particular square or not. But if you look at trends in occupancy, which is still a useful measure if that's all you can get, you get pretty good agreement. Okay, there's a bit of scatter, but you get pretty good agreement in these data sets using listing data between the structured data and the more casual lists. So I think there is an encouraging signal there that we should be able to obtain some useful information from these types of data if we can incorporate a level of effort. Here's the coverage from Eurobird Portal again. This is for 1 week in 2013. So you can see the coverage looks pretty impressive. But I'm afraid we've still got a bit of a sales job to do in terms of lists, because if you look at the coverage, you can see we're rather keen on lists in the UK, but other people not yet quite so keen. But we are, I think, as a collaboration, we've now got good agreement that this is definitely the way we need to go. So we will be seeking to develop our approach on that. So just to sum up, I think fully randomised sampling is ideal. But reasonably representative coverage appears to be often adequate. Repeat surveys of the same representative sites following a standardised protocol will often provide us with pretty good inferences. I think we've got to be very cautious about the use of simple casual records. There's huge amounts of this information and huge interest and actually huge demand from some policymakers to make use of this information, but I think it's a really big challenge. We may be able to do it in some cases, but there is, I would sound a serious note of caution here. I think semi-structured data offers much more encouraging possibilities, and I'm pretty sure that the route that we need to follow is to encourage people to, who are keen on collecting these sorts of biological data to move down a route of at least collecting list-based or other effort-based data so that we can control for that in the analyses. And occupancy models, as I've indicated, appear to at least offer one way forward in that direction. There's one or two very interesting recent papers really just based on theoretical data, for example by Bob D'Orazio, who suggested that actually combining data types, again, may offer quite a lot of power. And I think there really aren't any very good examples yet of doing that in practice for these types of data, but I think that's definitely a further direction to develop in the future. And just to remind you of the importance of detectability, here's a very difficult bird to detect, the grasshopper warbler, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've got time for a couple of questions, if anyone. Yeah. 2 questions then, right.
You said that the US ones, that you showed pictures where some of them corresponded really well and some of them didn't. Were you able to understand that in terms of particular characteristics of the bird? So is it particular characteristics of the birds, some of them they correspond and some of them they don't?
That's a good idea. That's a good point. I don't think they've actually done that in a sort of rigorous way in their paper. They've mainly focused on the overall broad pattern. But certainly, yeah, it would be sensible to try and go into it in that way. I'm sure you would find some relationships there, both in terms of ecological characteristics, also in terms of things like abundance. So yeah, it's certainly a useful idea to follow up.
Thinking about the amount of data that now is potentially coming from citizen science in its widest form, and given the power of social media, we've heard several times this conference, how things can change quite quickly on social media. Is there any possibility that institutes such as yourself can actually influence citizen scientists to be more rigorous in some way? So for you to proactively use social media to try and get more reliable results?
Yes, and we do, I think, is a short answer to that one. We have several staff who spend a lot of their time on Twitter on these sorts of things. But we also do think, so where we're running programs like BirdTrack, so for example, we try not only to think about telling people it's a very good idea for science to do lists, but we have a ranking of lists. So when you go on the BirdTrack homepage, you can see where you are on the ranking of listers. So we use sort of tricks like that to try and make it fun.
Yeah.
Because I think that's what it's, many people, particularly birders, but also people who look at other sorts of wildlife, they're really doing it because it's fun. And I think the trick is to find ways of making them feel that it will be fun to collect some rigorous data, rather than perhaps the old-fashioned attitude that still works with people like me, which is you say, go out and do this incredibly difficult survey because it's going to be really useful. But that doesn't, not everyone buys into that. So we've got to have that combination of approaches, and certainly Twitter is part of our armoury to do that, absolutely. Follow the BirdTrack Twitter feed.
Thanks, it's a really nice presentation of quality citizen science. I guess with the lists, the more things that you can tick boxes on, the more reluctant I am to sort of deliberately say, well, I didn't see that. You sort of almost need I didn't actually look for that. Have you got that incorporated in terms of these list-based terminologies? Like a sort of a presence and absence and I didn't look.
We don't have a didn't look. I mean, that's an interesting idea. I think what we encourage people to do is simply to tell us what they saw. I mean, that is an important message to get across. This is not a list of everything that was there, and if you didn't see it, it can't be a list. It's simply a list of what you saw. I think that's really important. And we know that people will differ in their ability to see things. For example, some people are very good at bird calls, others aren't. But I think we shouldn't get too worried about that. The really important thing is people tell us what they saw, and we just get that simple message across, and that's what we're working to do. But yeah, there are lots of other things that you can record, and we do offer lots of options. But there's a sort of trade-off here. If you give people too many options, sometimes they get put off by the options.
Right, thank you very much, everybody, and would you like to join me in thanking the other two speakers for a very interesting experience?